Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Keith. I am your host for today. Sorry. As I've mentioned before, I host on Sundays and Wednesdays. Usually the episodes get uploaded on Mondays and Thursdays. So this week is our final week on the book Brave New World, which did not end anywhere like I thought it would, or anyway like I thought it would, I guess would be the best way to phrase that. Needless to say, I was expecting something different than what I ended up getting, which is good, I guess. Overall, I think it's a really good book. I don't think I like the ending. And like I've mentioned several times before on the podcast and doing this book, I wouldn't be surprised to see this book coming off of reading lists for a lot of high schools. It is really, especially the ending, not great. The fact that this was on reading lists before, not totally sure what the thought process was behind that. I feel like as an adult reading this, I got so much more out of this than I would have as being a kid. Not to say that you shouldn't read things as a kid that you will get more out of as being an adult. Like, I think more kids should read Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49, seniors in high school, of course, or juniors. But this particular book, I just feel like a lot of what it is about is going to be lost on people who are younger and who lack as much experience as everybody else or as adults might have. Of course, there are exceptions where some kids will get it, but just the content is not necessarily reflective of the culture that we're currently in. And then on top of that, there are miscellaneous aspects of it that I really just felt were maybe in some regards too adult for kids in high school. So the fact that a lot of my peers read this in high school is a bit of a surprise to me. And I, if I were a teacher, would not select this book. I think 1984 or Fahrenheit 451 are both much more easily digestible. And on top of that, the deeper profundities of those works are going to be more easily understood by kids generally, which is important. It's nice to read things as a kid and maybe remember them as an adult, reflect on them. But, when it comes to like comprehension and such, I really think that it's important to read things that you're going to get the majority of. So we're going to start out this podcast with like a basic summary of how it is that the book goes, and then we'll circle back and focus on specific elements of it later. So, because this last bit, I listened through about an hour and 40 minutes of the book, and normally I only listen to about like 20 to 40 minutes of the book and then talk about it. So in order to try to go chronologically and talk about everything I'd like to talk about would be a little bit difficult, for lack of another word, because I think the main, the magnum opus of the book is the dialogue between Mustafa Mons and John the Savage, as well as Helmholtz and Bernard Marx are there as well. And I think that that's kind of the magnum opus of the book. the things that happen after that are, it's not that they're inconsequential necessarily. Like, they very much kind of like tie things up neatly, though we don't find out how the rest of Mark's and Helmholtz's lives go. I think that the ending of the book really kind of like shows, well, this is who the main character was really intended to be the entire time, and this is what happens to him. So I will say I am thankful. The relationship between John the Savage and Lenina is never renewed. I was a little worried about that. I felt that would be really problematic after the way that he like attacked her. And it would have felt very of the times as far as writing is concerned for an abused partner to go back to their partner because of some form of like unspoken or spoken commitment. So basically where we left off last, I believe, was that Linda had died and there was some fallout from there, and we were kind of watching Helmholtz and Marx and John the Savage kind of become friends. And then, like I said, Lenina and John the Savage's relationship kind of came to a toxic close. And Lenina is no longer in the book after that. She actually doesn't have any more parts after that portion of the book. So I found that to be interesting. I don't think that that's necessarily like a sign of Huxley's opinion on females as characters, or women as characters, rather. But I do think that it is worthy of note that she no longer appears after that. I just think that Huxley's main intent was for John the Savage to be the main character as soon as he was introduced, because a lot of what happens in the book after he is introduced is from his perspective. There's a pretty hard shift. So I would say that the first half of the book is kind of about like we had talked about this idea that, someone who is rejected by the system but wants to change the system to fit them versus someone who is rejected by the system and wants to change the system to benefit everyone who they feel is rejected by the system, and how those are two decidedly different pursuits, that both of which are sincere in their own right, but one of which kind of has a little bit more value overall than the other. And I think that that's definitely worth taking note of, because in my opinion, Huxley gives a much more credence to the person, that being John the Savage, who wants to change the system in favor of everyone rather than just in favor of themselves. We don't get very much more from Bernard Marx for the rest of the book. In fact, he becomes kind of like a pithy, whiny character that really is like decidedly undesirable, which I think is important to note for a number of reasons. So from the portion of the book where we were at, basically what happens is John the Savage continues to kind of like attempt to acclimate to some aspects of society, but is riddled with guilt and sadness and grief over the death of his mother at the hands of soma poisoning, which really, like, everyone dies at some point, and that's kind of like the general viewpoint the general view that people have in this particular world. And because they don't have an aversion to death, the idea of dying like a couple years earlier because of soma use isn't really a thing to them. And so I think that that's very interesting. It's kind of like almost like a nihilistic way to look at death. Like, well, it's going to happen, so why bother preventing it from happening? And so that I just found that to be interesting. Helmholtz and Bernard Marx don't do much more for the rest of the book. These last few chapters really are primarily focused on John the Savage. The main thing that happens that I think that really kind of gets us to the point in the book where we have that conversation between Mustafa Mons and John the Savage is that John the Savage is walking around somewhere and he sees, I believe it may be right after his mother has died and he's still in the hospital, or it's somewhere else. I can't really tell as far as chronologically how fast things were moving, because there's a lot of like text, obviously, between what happens with Lenina and him leaving to go to see his mother or watch his mother die. But he... if he's still in the hospital, then it would make sense. It could also make sense that this is a different day that he's doing this. But he's in the hospital, or a hospital, and they go to do soma distributions. And Soma seems to be about the only thing that has any kind of individual capitalist application in this world. It seems like everybody is equal in pretty much everything except for like specific aspects of income and spending. So everyone lives a certain level of life, but everyone is kind of allowed to purchase Soma and take Soma at their own discretion, which I found to be interesting, that it's not like rationed. You get to go in and purchase it, but it's called a Soma distribution. So John the Savage is in the hospital, and they are doing a Soma distribution, and he sees, I think, like 80 twins, which means that they're deltas and gammas, which, as we know, are pretty far down on the food chain, if you will. And so as he's standing there watching them get ready to purchase all of this Soma, and he starts to push towards the front of the crowd because he wants to see kind of what's going on, and everyone starts to get rowdy, and there's a person there who is kind of there they're designated to control the crowd. So they say they're not going to sell the Soma until everybody quiets down. And at this point, John's already at the front, which has made some people upset because, there's just a way that you do things. Like when you get there, and everyone's going to get theirs, and you don't have to push to the front to worry about getting any. So he gets to the front. Everybody is calmed down by the fact that they are going to be allowed to purchase their Soma accordingly. And John decides that he is going to say something to all these people because he's just watched Linda die of using this stuff in abundance. And so he tries to beseech the crowd that they are throwing their life away in some capacity. They're willing or willfully consuming poison, and that it is going to kill them. And not only that, it kills their soul. It basically is like living a false life. And I think that this is kind of Huxley's commentary on the idea of like just any substance or belief structure or anything that distracts you from the real world around you is negative, is ultimately anything that distracts from your awareness of reality is something that is undesirable by Huxley's definition of it, as far as I can tell from what he's saying. And so John spends a good, a fair amount of time just saying, you guys shouldn't do this. Please don't do this. Don't purchase this stuff. It's literally straight poison. And, of course, the crowd starts to get a little rowdy. And so John ultimately decides that he is going to take the Soma and throw it out the window and not let anyone have any, because he believes, that it's poison, and that ultimately it's the heroin of the masses, as Marx would say. And during this time, Marx and Helmholtz have been looking for John and haven't been able to find him. So eventually they get a call from the hospital, I believe, telling them that he is at the hospital causing all of this trouble. So they go to the hospital and realize that the crowd, and they see John at the beginning of his throwing the Soma out the window, and the crowd gets a little restless and decides that they're going to try to stop him from throwing their precious Soma out the window, because as we know, Soma is, I don't know if I'd say it's highly addictive. There was no indication as to whether or not it was addictive physically, but it is addictive psychologically. It's an escapism thing. And so Helmholtz eventually comes to John's aid and says, freedom for everybody is right. John is basically saying that Soma is part of what keeps you enslaved and keeps you doing all of these menial tasks and keeps you participating in the peaceable oppressiveness or peaceable oppression of a government that basically rules in a way that actively prevents individuality. And so Helmholtz helps to throw the Soma out the window, and then when fighting breaks out, he helps to defend John the Savage. And of course, because there's a fight there, obviously the hospital staff are going to call the police. So the police get called to the scene, and basically they release an airborne form of Soma to calm everybody down. And then on top of that, they have this soothing recording that's just telling people relax and, don't worry, everyone's going to get their soma. We're going to stop all of this. And they do some other interesting things that we're going to talk about right after this quick commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Right before the break, we were talking about what the police did when they showed up at the hospital as John was throwing the soma supply out the window, as well as his safety. So when the cops get there, like I had mentioned before, they release a soma aerosol into the air. Obviously, that's what aerosol does. And then play an audio track of somebody talking in a very soothing voice to calm the crowd down. And the way that the gentleman who was supposed to be distributing the soma treats John is also worthy of note because he treats him kind of like an animal. And then the police treat everybody like animals. So I found that to be interesting. And then also in this scene, like the whole thing is very animalistic. Huxley uses a lot of imagery that tends toward that particular theme. And what he does is he describes the police as swine masked. And I think that the reason that he does that is not necessarily to speak ill of police in general, though that is arguable. It's to kind of give us a better image of what it is that they look like and how everyone is behaving. Because the deltas and gammas who are clamoring for this soma and getting upset at the person who threw it out the window are ultimately acting like as Huxley describes them, like swine jockeying at the trough, I believe is the specific wording that he uses, which is, a very vivid and probably accurate image of what it is that's going on. And so he, of course, is, basically trying to describe the chaos of the scene, and then the police show up and they're wearing gas masks so they don't inhale the soma. And if you know what a gas mask looks like, it has that like round filter on the very front that kind of looks a little bit like a pig's snout. And so I believe that he's just trying to emphasize like how everybody is behaving animalistically, and then the cops come in and act animalistically by kind of like removing everyone's ability to interact with each other in a sincere fashion, including John, Helmholtz, and Marx. They are all affected by the soma as well. And so the police, they end up like water pistoling, I think is what it's called, but it's basically like a very high-powered water pistol that causes a lot of pain. They water pistol Marx because he tries to tell them, like, hurry, you should get over there, they're going to get killed. Because Helmholtz and John are right now like fighting against this mob who's attacking them for throwing their soma out the window. And then they get the crowd under control and they redistribute a new batch of soma, and everybody goes away happy. And ultimately the police decide that they're going to take all three of them to the controller, who is Mustafa Mons. And this is where we get the magnum opus, if you will, of this book, where John the Savage finally gets to be in direct contact with the controller of London, and the controller of London is named Mustafa Mons. And what a controller's job is to do is, I believe that they're like an alpha, a double plus alpha is what it's called. So basically they are the very top of the food chain, of the hierarchy, if you will. And they are responsible for ensuring the, cooperation isn't necessarily the right word, adherence of the mob to the hierarchy. They're responsible for making sure that the other alphas don't get too far out of line. They're responsible for ensuring that everything runs as smoothly as possible. And they hold a pretty high status in society overall, as is evidenced by the fact that every other alpha is always looking to be in contact with Mustafa Mons, including Marx. And Marx reports to Mustafa Mons, especially in regards to John the Savage, who has been kind of the subject of a fair amount of experimentation by Mustafa Mons. And what we find out is that Bernard Marx and Helmholtz are going to be sent to an island. That island is Iceland, which was, of course, Marx's biggest fear because he did not want to get sent to the island. It's just kind of showing, and even though Marx wasn't involved in the conflict in any way, like he didn't come to anyone's aid, and he tries to slink away at the end of all of it. Marx is kind of portrayed as being this catalyst for change or interest at the beginning of it, but it becomes very clear through his interactions with John the Savage that, like, his goal was never to create change. It was just to endear others to him for being different, not to endear himself to others for being different. So Marx ultimately gets the punishment that he deserves, in my opinion, because his biggest thing is that he is destined to be an outlier because of the way that he looks and because of what happened to him when he was being conditioned as an embryo. But because of that, and in spite of that, he tries to hold two things at once, hold two beliefs at once, where he can be the outsider and the string puller without having to get his hands dirty. And it seems like Wilhelm, who is not have given any indication that he's interested in what's going on with everything, other than just being interested truly in John the Savage as a person, Wilhelm seems relatively okay with the fact that he's being sent to an island. And the idea of an island is something that Huxley plays with a lot throughout this book. The idea of isolation, the idea of separation, is something that is very important to Huxley. I don't know if he's intentionally trying to compare it to the ideas of like holiness. The root and original meaning of holiness is to be separate. So I think that he ultimately gets a lot of what he's looking for, or Huxley gets a lot of what he might be looking for in that like religious language type way, without necessarily doing it intentionally. And I think that's just a sign of a really good writer, where everything that you're doing kind of plays into this grand meta narrative that is pervasive throughout the book. So Helmholtz and Marx are decided that they're going to be sent off to an island, and Mustafa Mons tells them about an island that existed at some point of all alpha pluses. And basically this is brought up by a line of questioning that John the Savage has for Mustafa Mons, because Mustafa Mons is kind of curious, like, why are you upset about the things that are happening around you? Why do you feel the way that you do, etc.? And tries to actually see John for what John is. And I think that this is interesting that he's able to do that. But he tells him first that, like, the way that they get there is that John basically says, like, look, you're poisoning these people. And Mustafa Mons says, but they choose to be poisoned. And then John retorts by saying, but you conditioned them to want to be poisoned. And then Mustafa Mons basically says, like, well, then, like, what does it matter if they're conditioned or if they're choosing? You know, like, what's the difference? Ultimately, the choice would probably be the same, that they would choose Soma. And he makes the point that deltas and gammas are the wrong people to espouse freedom to, and espouse these abstract ideas of like justice and liberty to, because they've been conditioned to enjoy the basically crappy existence that they're given. You know, do this menial labor, do this task that nobody else wants to do, and get paid a meager, like the bare minimum amount for it, but take joy in the fact and take pride in the fact that you ultimately are the one or you are a contributor to an overall society in a specific way. And at first this seems kind of insincere, but eventually we find out that Mustafa Mons himself used to be an artist of sorts. He was a culinary artist. He loved to experiment with food. And before given the option to be a controller, he was offered to be sent to an island like Iceland as well. And he ended up turning it down because to him, he ended up deciding that there was joy to be found in the act of him playing his role in society. And his role as an alpha plus or an alpha double plus is ultimately to become a controller or something like that. I think there was like a speaker or something like that who was like a promoter of things, and they're an alpha plus plus as well, I believe. So there's a limited number of things that alpha double pluses get to do. And ultimately, they have more free will than the deltas and the gammas in some capacity because they get to choose in some regard whether or not it is that they decide to conform. And that is made evident by the fact that Mustafa Mons says, like, I had to choose between the art that I had and the reality that I live in. And I ended up choosing the reality because I felt that I had more to offer in choosing the reality than I did in choosing the art. And there is just a number of profundities within this particular portion of the dialogue before we get to the other thing I was going to talk about. We're on a rabbit hole, and I apologize. That I think are important about maybe Huxley's view of different things. And so I think that, a lot of these future dystopia novels rely on the fact that ultimately either people are being manipulated into choosing to participate into this thing or in this totalitarian governance, or they're being forced to by fear. And I think that Huxley does a good job of kind of incorporating both of those things. There is a social contract that's created by the manipulation of individuals, and this is something that I don't think other novels have gotten as effectively. Like Fahrenheit 451 gets close, and so does 1984. But there's just something special about the way in which society so heavily influences people in this novel that I don't think other novels get to. So there's a philosopher by the name of Rousseau, and I can't remember, The Spectacle of Something is a book that he wrote, and it basically outlines this idea that like everyone is going through the act of behaving in certain ways in order to obtain a certain things, and it's very transactional in the employment of social contract. And this book does a great job of saying, like, well, when the social contract shifts because there is a general agreement upon a certain number of ideas, then it becomes there becomes a new social contract that you now have to participate in the spectacle of acting out, even if you don't necessarily believe it. And you might eventually come to believe it. I don't think that Mustafa Mons believes it. I think that he's actively chosen that believing in it as an action is more beneficial than fighting against it as an action. And so he'll believe in it as an action and hold as a belief that it is not actually maybe the best possible outcome. But because the best possible outcome might be the one that he knows, and he can know the outcome of this, he ultimately chooses to pursue the thing that he knows the outcome of. And I think that's important to take note of that because I think that's part of Huxley's overall commentary on the idea of like capitalism, economics, and society in general, is that we are ultimately all acting on certain impulses that are based off of lower level desires that have been conditioned in us by the people who were doing the same thing that we're doing prior to us having done it. So we learn from our parents to do things in a certain way in the same way that these people are raised up in a factory and learn to do things in a certain way through the training and conditioning they receive in the factories. And John is not satisfied with this answer because he really is a proponent for a lot of like freedom and these other things, and basically is saying like, well, no, that just doesn't make sense because like, look how much happier you can be with the freedom of choice. And Mustafa Mons says, but look how happy they are now. They don't know that there's more. They're ignorant. And this is obviously, or not obviously, in my opinion, it's a pretty overt reference to like religious beliefs and the perhaps the governance that a church body provides over its parishioners, especially something that's heavily organized like the Catholic Church. So we're going to get into what I think Huxley is saying about organized religion and society a little bit more right after this next commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Right before the break, I was talking about what it is I think that Huxley might in part be saying about organized religion and organized governance in specific regards to the statements that Mustafa Mons makes about the idea of choosing a certain kind of happiness over art. So basically what Mustafa Mons says is that he ended up choosing to assist in ensuring the conformity of the general populace of the world, specifically of these like countries controlled by the world governance, to continue the generally happy and ultimately benign existence of all of its members, because he believed that the presence of choice and the presence of liberty was ultimately a lower net happiness than the ability to just kind of fall in line, do what it is that you're conditioned to do, act in the way that you're designed to act, and consume soma to make up for the inequities there. Because basically what he says is that the world we've created has no suffering. Because if you suffer, you just take soma and then you don't suffer anymore. You just, that's just it. And I think that is, I don't know, there's a lot of, especially considering one of the characters that gets mentioned later specifically by name, there's a lot of Darwinianism in this particular portion of the book. And what I mean by that, and the reason I bring up the idea of like the Catholic Church is, and I've mentioned this idea before, the idea of the great chain of being is an idea that was focused on a lot in my history classes as a child, especially like European history, that one I took in college. But the idea is that it's like focused around that specific concept pretty heavily. And I generally think that is kind of what Huxley is trying to imply here, is that people are made in a way that they're only going to know what it is that they're conditioned to know. They're not going to be able to learn outside of that. And that there are rare exceptions to that rule, but those people are exemplary in some regard. It's kind of like Kierkegaard's idea of the genius and Nietzsche's idea of the genius, which I will also say, like, it's very clear to me that Huxley was abundantly familiar with Nietzsche. Either that or he's just like that guy in The Other Guys who makes those TLC references constantly and pretends like he doesn't know that he's making them, or at least claims to not have any knowledge of TLC. So Huxley would have to claim the same thing in order for me to think he didn't read or wasn't familiar with Nietzsche ultimately. I think that ultimately Huxley is trying to say that he thinks that there is a hierarchy implicit within society, whether it is something that is, whether or not a hierarchy is artificially created by human beings or a hierarchy is just allowed to naturally exist. There is, I believe in Huxley's opinion, a hierarchy that we all are forced into conformity with. So I am only conditioned to know so much about the world around me, and knowing more might hinder my ability to become happy. It's basically just a very thought out and long-winded way to say ignorance is bliss. And the specific mention of like the great chain of being comes from the idea that if you were born into a royal family, like you were born better or above somebody else. And the people who are in power, of course, would say, like, no, it's not that we're above. It's just that this is what we're designed to do. We are designed to lead. Whereas someone who is born into a lower caste is not designed to lead. They're designed to do their thing on the farm, to live in squalor, and to die a good peasant, if you will. And that was a very pervasive idea in the Catholic Church during the medieval era and beyond for a long period after that. I mean, until the tennis court accord, I think is what it's called, or the tennis debate. I don't know. But it's basically a bunch of people who gathered on a tennis court and said the Magna Carta. Yeah, it's all the people who got together and created the Magna Carta, which is like the original, the people want to govern themselves document from Britain that kind of, it doesn't necessarily inspire a lot of other things, but it is part of what inspires a lot of movements later on. Obviously, Protestantism is really big in that movement, especially considering the largest authoritative body at the time prior to Protestantism was the church. And so Luther. Yeah, I can't remember his name. I don't remember his name. I don't know why I'm having trouble. That's weird. Anyway, Michael Scott. That's from The Office. Wow, way to go, Keith. But Luther is ultimately Luther, I believe is his name. I don't remember. The guy who does the 101 complaints or the 99 complaints about the church that he nails to the wall. He's a big influence on the movement of liberty and freedom, movements of liberty and freedom that come after, because he's basically saying, like, here's my finger to the church, and like, we deserve to be able to make decisions on our own. We're capable. And this is obviously something that comes under a lot of scrutiny. There's another philosopher who is French who basically, Alexis de Tocqueville, I believe it's a man, he writes a book that basically is on the great American experiment of democracy, and he is talking about how, like, not everyone should govern themselves, and he would ultimately fall into the camp that there are some people who are incapable of governing themselves. And I think that to some degree Huxley is at least experimenting with this idea in the same way that he would experiment with the idea through like a religious means or a governance means. Basically just saying, like, some people are just the way that they are, and ultimately talking to them about liberty isn't going to do anything. They're happy and content to live their lives the way that they live them and don't see the need to seek anything greater. And that if you do see the need to seek something greater, that you ought to exist outside of those people. I don't even think necessarily that Brave New World in every aspect is a negative thing to Huxley. I think he might be writing some of it very neutrally and saying, you know, like, what if the idea of being a genius, quote unquote, is something that is just part of the natural hierarchy of being that does exist? Because I think that Huxley would subscribe to the idea that there is a hierarchy of cognitive function, that some people are made to function in different ways than others. And because Huxley is a member of the class that functions differently than others, he's not going to say that, well, they're better, but the people who are below, quote unquote, that status, the people who don't think like Huxley, are going to think of Huxley as thinking of himself as better, because ultimately Huxley will experience other things that they won't get to, that they would say, like, well, maybe I want that thing. And so a lot of what happens in this particular thing or this particular book that I think Huxley is railing against is this idea of envy, and how if you remove the idea of envy from the equation, if the people who don't necessarily want to think in certain ways aren't forced to look at somebody who thinks in a different way and see that that other person might be succeeding more, then they won't have any desire to be any different than how they were conditioned to be. And if they ever do, you just distract them with drugs or religion or any other thing that basically serves as a sedative for the life that you're living. A sedative for the suffering. And that's what Mustafa Mons ultimately has decided. And then he's decided this in part because of an experiment that happened, he doesn't specify the time, but he just specifies knowledge of it, where they took all of they took 30,000 alpha plus pluses and put them all on an island together and said, like, okay, go make a society. And the majority of the alpha plus pluses didn't want to have to do menial labor. They started like starving and all sorts of other things because they couldn't find joy or happiness in the tasks that were beneath them, quote unquote. And then all of the people who were in the upper echelons, I'm not going to say quote unquote anymore, just know I'm using air quotes for most of these, didn't want to relinquish their positions. And so ultimately it resulted in a civil war where of the 30,000, 19,000 killed each other. And so 11,000 were left. And apparently they voted unanimously to have the World Governance Organization come and take over the island. And what that said to Mustafa Mons is that people aren't capable of governing themselves. But I think that maybe what Huxley might be implying here, or what's worthy of thought, is that all of those alpha plus pluses were conditioned to think that they were special and ought to not have to do the things that were beneath them, quote unquote. So I think that we have a similar struggle in society today, where we look at classism between blue collar workers and white collar workers, and how the disparity in wealth that occurs between the two of those two classes. I think that in the world of academia, we see this, where individuals who are maybe more talented at specific parts of academia are lauded above other members or other people who aren't as good at those specific aspects. There's a lot of emphasis placed on the idea of STEM, but not necessarily as much emphasis placed on the intelligence required for something like English as a major, or art, or music, or philosophy. All of those things are, they require an equal amount of intelligence, in my opinion, but they aren't necessarily touted as being special in the same way that STEM is touted as being special. We don't say, I'm not a philosopher. We say, I'm not a rocket scientist. So there is intrinsic to society this idea that certain things are better than. And I think that if those alpha plus pluses hadn't been conditioned to be alpha plus pluses in the society that they were originally conditioned to be that in, then they would maybe have acted differently. Because I think that something that Jean-Paul Sartre and a number of his peers in existentialism, which they ultimately came around the same time and a little bit after what Huxley was writing, talked about how there is beauty in the monotony of life, and you get to choose that beauty. And what Mustafa Mons and Huxley are essentially saying is that people don't do that. People choose to be upset because they're denied something. Again, this idea of envy, which I think is an important thing to note, because that seems to be kind of rampant throughout this society, is the elimination of envy, as it seems to be the root of a lot of conflict, and they desire above all else to not have conflict. And I think that root of envy being pervasive throughout this book is part of what makes it so good, because if you look at other incredibly famous works, what is the primary reason for the initial conflict? Talking about the Bible, talking about Shakespeare, it's almost always envy, a desire for a thing that somebody else has or something that you don't have that you want. It's reliant upon this idea that you don't have enough. And I think that ultimately Huxley is basically saying that people aren't capable of overcoming that idea in a substantial enough way to where they could lead a successful life if it were still present. So you have to manipulate it out of them through conditioning, through soma use, etc. And this is just one of the really important things that is exchanged between Mustafa Mons and John the Savage. And, I don't know that I'm going to be able to get through everything I want to get through, because we haven't even finished the book. There's still a little bit left. But we will continue to talk about this right after this last quick commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
That was our last commercial break for today. We are in the final stretch of the final chapters of the end of, I guess final chapters is, of the end of Brave New World. Before the break, I was kind of talking about Huxley's implication that he might subscribe to the ideas of the Great Chain of Being. I think that was important to note. Not necessarily trying to say that Huxley absolutely believed in that, just that I think that he's either trying to comment on or make a statement about his beliefs in the idea that certain people just aren't born to think about things the way that he thinks about them. And, while I do somewhat agree with that idea, I think that he maybe paints it in a way that is a little more negative than it ought to be. And as I mentioned before, oftentimes the people who are the beneficiaries of those types of belief structures don't believe that they're actually being condescending towards others, but in a way they kind of are ultimately. So then I'll leave that up to you guys to interpret. But the rest of the book is also pretty good and has some important things in it. I wish I could spend a little bit more time talking about Mustafa Mons and John the Savage's exchange, but I'm going to have to finish it off with this thought so I can make sure to get to the ending of the book. But Mustafa Mons basically says that, if you want the thing that you're describing, if you want liberty, if you want this freedom, then you have to be willing to take everything that comes with it. And the specific thing that kind of inspires that statement is that John the Savage is asking, why don't you have these other books available to people? You only have new books. You don't have Othello or the Bible or other old texts. And basically Mustafa Mons says, we don't have them because they're old. It's not that there's anything wrong with them. It's that they're old and that we've evolved past them. And I think that that's kind of the biggest thing to Mustafa Mons and to Huxley is that we will eventually evolve past all of the forms of art and literature and such. Literature is art. I don't know why I said that. I just was going to start listing off things. But that we will evolve eventually past all these forms of entertainment and find the need to create new forms of entertainment that are more conducive to the evolution that mankind or humankind undergoes as time goes by. And he especially makes this evident when he talks about religion, because he says that it's not that I don't believe in God, it's just that we evolved past the need for God. Now there's no need to pray about something that you're upset about, you just take soma. Now there's no need to do this or do that. And that's part of the reason why I said I think that a lot of this book is religious commentary on Huxley's part, because ultimately the penultimate portion of the book is spent, a lot of it is spent in this idea of this is the new God, this is the new religion, and we've killed the original one through evolution. We've killed it through not only the idea of evolution, but the process of evolution. And ultimately, that is why things have become the way that they've become, why we don't consume things that are old, and things like that. And he tells John the Savage, if you want all this freedom, all these other things, you have to take the things that come with them. You have to take all of this, savagery and pain and being upset and envy and murder and all of this, law-breaking stuff. And John the Savage says, I'll take all of it. I would have all of that over what it is that you have. And I don't know if Huxley is trying to say, I would too. I think that Huxley is really honestly presenting it in a very neutral way. It's kind of like that. I don't remember who the theologian is that says that this is the best of all possible worlds, but it's John the Savage basically saying, like, you know, you are saying this is the best of all possible worlds because it's the world that you know and can't conceive of something better. And John the Savage says, like, I believe the world I know is the one that can be conceived as better. But ultimately, I don't think either of them are totally right. I don't think that John the Savage's way is the correct way, and I definitely don't think that Mustafa Mann's way is the correct way. But they kind of come to an impasse where it kind of sounds like a lot of the conservative rhetoric with immigrants might not be the right word, but like immigration laws. Like, if you don't like it here, then leave. And that's basically what Mustafa Mann says. But in a way where he's like, well, if you don't like it here, sucks to suck, because you're staying here because I don't want you to leave, because I am currently experimenting with you. And John the Savage really wants to leave because he's done being experimented on. He, in fact, wants to go to the island with Wilhelm? Is that no, Helmholtz. Gosh darn it, I keep getting his name wrong. With Helmholtz and Marx. But he is not allowed to. So John the Savage, eventually runs away and goes to a lighthouse in a place called Surrey. The Savage of Surrey is basically what he becomes. And while he's there, he starts to take up a lot of very like ancient religious practices, especially ones that involve like self-harm in order to purify or experience certain aspects of life. I don't think that he's doing it in a way that reflects like the ideas of needing more purity, but he's doing it in a way that ultimately I find to not be very positive generally, which, you know, not necessarily great. So he decides that he's going to live in isolation because one of the biggest things that is mentioned in his dialogue with Mustafa Mons is that people only come to these conclusions when they're allowed to be alone. People only envy when they're allowed to be alone. They only experience negativity when they're alone. And so we don't let them be alone ever. And John the Savage is now forced to live in that world. And in some way, it's funny because and even John the Savage reflects on this, he was in pain and suffering when he was forced to be alone as a child, but now as an adult, all he wants is to be able to be alone for like any amount of time, and he can't. And I would argue that in some regard, this might be Huxley saying that he wants the same thing and can't have it. I think that that's kind of a funny idea that Huxley's an introvert in an extroverted world, and he's complaining through this book that is lasting, you know, that will be in our lexicon for probably 100 years, unless something crazy happens in the next 17 years, which, based on the way 2020 is going, who even knows? So, all of that to say, he moves to this lighthouse and is being watched by a photographer by the name of Darwin Bonaparte, which like the illusions based on names at this point are just like, dude, Huxley, come on, what are you doing? Darwin? Like, it's already incredibly obvious that there's some element of social Darwinism and evolutionary Darwinism within here. You just said that man evolved past God. So I think that Huxley is kind of trying to imply that there is like an evolution within the function of the brain in addition to the function of the body, which would fall in line, of course, with Darwinian ideas. But I think that Huxley's taking it further and saying that individuals are also subject to a number of other changes. And I think that that's important to note because Huxley is trying to say that the best of all possible worlds will also evolve. So the world that we know now might not be the best one. And the world that is known by the people who are in this society in Brave New World might not be the best one. And I think he even mentions that like those people will die. And ultimately that's true. Everything dies. Everything ends. And I think that that is a very interesting and poetic sentiment that Huxley is reflecting beautifully and subtly in this book. At the end of it, he's basically saying like, this is the way that things were at this time, but that doesn't mean that it's the way that things will always be. And so Darwin, in his observations of John the Savage, captures a lot of moments with him, but specifically captures this moment where he where John the Savage is using a whip to punish himself for having had tempting thoughts about Lenina. He just is generally not okay with even remembering her in any regard. And so Darwin makes a movie, or in this case a feelie, out of this whole experience of watching the Savage of Surrey. And he names it The Savage of Surrey. And I don't know if he makes a ton of money off of it. There's never any mention of that. But basically, everybody gets to go to the feelies and experience the pain and the manicness and the depression and sadness of the Savage of Surrey. And so naturally, this gains John the Savage a lot of fame again, and everyone starts to show up at his lighthouse asking him to like show them the whip and this and that. And he assaults a couple people and says, like, leave, I don't want to be bothered by you. But ultimately, they continue to bother him and continue to, like, use him to solicit feelies. And I think that it's interesting that he gets turned into a movie that people experience because he specifically mentions, like, why doesn't anybody make anything new and interesting? And then here he is now the new and interesting thing, and he hates it. And I think that might be part of what Huxley is complaining about, too. Like, oh, look, my books are popular now, and I hate that they're popular. And I feel like that's just as insincere as anything else being popular. So it just feels like a kind of darned if you do, darned if you don't type thing that I really appreciated coming from Huxley. And the ending of this book is kind of like a trigger warning, just so you all know. It ends ambiguously, but I think it's pretty obvious, in my opinion, that John the Savage has decided to hang himself. Hence your trigger warning. The last scene of the book is somebody walking in and seeing his feet dangling beneath the staircase or beneath an archway, and they're just kind of turning slowly in a pattern. Kind of like a pendulum, if you will, but Huxley does this in a very precise way where he says, like, they point southeast and then east and then south, and then they point this way and this way and this way, and it just feels very rhythmic. Like, you can almost hear the sound of the creaking beam that's supporting the rope as he swings back and forth from it. And I know that's really dark, and I do apologize. Like I said, trigger warning. But I think that it's worthy of talking about how well it is that Huxley portrays this. And in addition to that, I feel like it's really biblical because it sounds kind of like reference to Judas, who also commits suicide by hanging. And ultimately, I think the ambiguity of the ending of the book is supposed to give us a little bit of hope that maybe John the Savage doesn't decide to do that. But I think it's pretty evident from everything that John the Savage says that, like, if I can't live in the way that I choose to live, if I can't have liberty, then I don't want to live at all. Give me liberty or give me death, right? And I think that Huxley might be kind of trying to say the same thing, but through John the Savage. And ultimately, John the Savage is only punished by himself. He is punished by the world, but he chooses to view it as punishment, whereas Marx wants everything that John the Savage has. He wants the attention. He wants the notoriety. He wants this and that and doesn't get any of it and is punished for it. Whereas, like, John the Savage ends up punishing himself for just being even just an unwilling participant in this world that he doesn't want to be a part of. And I think that overall this book is just generally it's a thought experiment. I don't think it's necessarily trying to say anything specific about anything. It's just trying to say, like, look at a proposal and ask honest questions about what the consequences of that proposal are. What are the consequences of us eliminating the implicit desire to remain celibate in some regard? What are the consequences of us cloning people? Which I don't think was really a thing at the time, but it is a thing in this book, and now it's a thing. I think that this book serves as a way to kind of facilitate a lot of interesting and important thought experiments, and this book has come into my head almost every time I've gone to have a philosophic discussion in the last 3-4 weeks that we've been looking at it. So I highly recommend it. I hope that you enjoyed listening to me talk about it. I don't know where we're going to go from here as far as next few episodes are concerned. I know that we'll be talking about Endymion a lot because I want to get through that book. But that is pretty much that. So that's all I've got for you guys today. I really appreciate you listening and going through this journey with me. I loved reading this book with completely and totally blind. So let me know what you guys thought in the comments, what you think of the book, what you thought of the podcasts, etc. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, leave a review. We would love that. We're also on Facebook. So thank you again for listening, everybody. Stay safe out there, and happy spooky season. It's officially October. So have a good day, everybody.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.